So welcome everyone. I'll get started just with some housekeeping points before we officially open the event. So my name is Sophie Tomlinson and I'm the Outreach and Communications Manager at the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. It's really a pleasure to welcome you all today. We have more than 360 participants registered from 60 countries. So thank you for being here. And throughout the event, you are really encouraged to include questions and comments in the Q&A and any general interactions you have with your fellow participants in the chat. And we've also allocated some time at the end of the event for interactive breakout groups. So we plan to actually collect your questions and address them there. So we really hope you can join. And you might see in the program that we have allocated 10 minutes for these breakout groups, but actually they will be open for at least 30 minutes for discussions and perhaps longer if there is interest. So today's conference is divided into three main parts. Part one will be starting with an opening discussion on the state of digital cooperation. In part two, we're going to invite members of the I&J contact groups to share the key jurisdictional challenges they are working on and why the work is useful. And then in part three, we will provide a presentation on the 3 I&JPN Toolkits, the result of hundreds of stakeholders' cooperation. And we'll also share opportunities for engagement and future work of the policy programs. And finally, as I said, we will end on the breakout groups. So for those who may be not as familiar with the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network as others, we will start with a short video to kick off the event. Great, a great reminder of how lovely it was to see everyone.
Yeah, I was exactly thinking the same. My God, how much are we missing that?
Exactly. So now I would like to give the floor to Paul Fellinger, I&J's Deputy Executive Director and Co-founder, for some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Sophie. A warm welcome to everybody who's actively engaged in the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network in the past, and especially a warm welcome to all of you who join us today for the first time. It is really an honor and a tremendous pleasure to kick off the launch of the 3 toolkits for practitioners today. It is wonderful to virtually at least see such a wide range of stakeholders from around the world gathering in this virtual event to learn more about these milestone outcomes of the policy network. When The Economist reported on the first global conference of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network in 2016, they summarized eloquently the call of stakeholders. And here I quote, they said, "What is needed is more international cooperation, but not of the old kind." The Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network unites since 2012 an ever-growing community of key actors from governments, companies, technical operators, civil society, academia, and international organizations who care about the future of the cross-border internet and ultimately about the future of our digital societies. Together, this community strives to enhance legal interoperability in cyberspace through new, innovative pathways. I am therefore elated to now officially launch these important and implementable outcomes of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. We are circulating the links now live in the chat, and you will have the access to the portals. You can download the toolkits, and you're invited to share them. As you will learn today in detail, each of these 3 toolkits on cross-border content moderation, access to electronic evidence, and DNS level action to address abuses explains core jurisdictional challenges, provides insights in the innovative methodology of the policy network, and equips practitioners and policymakers with much needed tools, typologies, and frameworks. These toolkits are a milestone in terms of concrete and usable outcomes produced collaboratively by diverse stakeholders from all groups around the world. And similar to the protocols of the internet, the more actors who will actively use and check their current and future practices and policies against these toolkits, the more we will collectively solve acute jurisdictional challenges and enhance legal interoperability. Practitioners who are confronted with dealing with cross-border issues every day and policymakers designing new mechanisms will find in these toolkits guidance to develop better interoperable solutions to concrete cross-border issues that require transnational standards, innovative coordination mechanisms, and workflows between numerous public and private stakeholders. Let me share a few statistics with you to better appreciate the spearheading cooperation effort in the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network that led to these toolkits today. Since the first global conference in 2016, almost 250 stakeholders have been members of our 3 programs contact groups. You find their names in the chat and in the toolkits. They are coming from 186 organizations, from all stakeholder groups, and from over 25 countries around the world. A conservative estimation is that over 7,000 hours of active work of this community were necessary to progress from a common framing of challenges to these operational solutions. And this does not include the time the Secretariat spent in enabling this remarkable cooperation across silos and regions. And I speak in the name of the entire Secretariat when I say how proud we are of the work that has been accomplished by this joint effort of the policy network. The work has in the past been recognized by various important fora. This includes the context of the G7 process, the inaugural Paris Peace Forum, or the UN Secretary General High-Level Panel's report on digital cooperation, where the policy network was recognized as a global cooperation mechanism. Ladies and gentlemen, please join us, because we are not together, unfortunately, given the circumstances, in front of your screens with a special round of virtual applause for this pioneering and tireless work of the members of the contact groups of our 3 programs that developed these toolkits together and the wider I&J community that contributed to this effort. Bravo, I say. We are equally grateful to all the actors who have made this work possible through their support of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. The over 20 leading actors who provide financial support to the Secretariat, the 6 international organizations who institutionally support our global conference, and the 3 previous host countries. I want to finish with 2 personal thoughts on this important day. One, I believe that these toolkits, through addressing acute and complex cross-border issues at a very detailed level, can contribute to de-escalating the looming legal arms race in cyberspace that we are all witnessing. They can help our ecosystem to build a positive future for the cross-border internet. And the second point that I want to share is that I believe how these toolkits were developed is as important for our ecosystem as the outcomes themselves. They are an embodiment of a particular kind of spirit of cooperation and a real demonstration that the multi-stakeholder approach can produce concrete operational outcomes. So thank you so much for being here today with us. I am really excited about our program for you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I would now like to give the floor to I&J's Executive Director and Co-founder, Bertrand de la Chapelle, for a discussion on the state of digital cooperation with Vint Cerf, the co-founder of the Internet and Vice President at Google, Henriette Esterhuizen, Chair of the UN Internet Governance Forum's Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group and Senior Advisor at the Association of Progressive Communications, and Stefan Schnorr, Director General of Ministry of Economy and Energy, Germany. Bertrand, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sophie. As Paul said, one of the big challenges is to find innovative approaches to all those things. And it's a pleasure to be here with Vint, with Stefan and Henriette, because this is a work that is a collaborative work. And we thought that it was important in this environment to place this in the context of the general discussion about digital cooperation. Mainly to take stock of how we're faring in terms of implementing the tools and the methods to solve the issues that we have been confronted with, but also to take the opportunities and seize the amazing opportunities that the digital era brings. What is at stake and what I would like to have as the discussion here is what kind of stock taking can we make and what kind of a nuanced approach can we have on the state of digital cooperation today? Because we don't want either too dramatic or catastrophic vision of things that are not going well, but we don't want a rosy picture either. So what I want is to basically ask you, the three of you, to go into a few questions. And the first one I would start with Vint, because as Sophie mentioned, you are one of the co-founders of the Internet, but also importantly, you have been witnessing in the course of the years the creation, and you've participated in the creation of a large number of the entities and the institutions that help the organization of the governance of the Internet itself. You've even been the chair of the ICANN board at one point. And in that context, there's nobody that is better placed than you to basically ask the question or answer the question that Kofi Annan was mentioning back in 2004, which is we need to be as creative in dealing with governance on the Internet as the people who invented it. So are we as creative as we need to be?
Well, thank you so much, Bertrand, for asking the question. Let me preface my remarks by thanking you and Paul particularly for taking what began as a discussion that was admiring the problem to something that actually is trying to help solve it. And that is a non-trivial exercise to have achieved the creation of something of substance that could actually be used. I'm actually astonished that you succeeded because it's such a hard problem. So look, the Internet has been evolving for almost 50 years, if you include its predecessor, the ARPANET. And we have seen how powerful this technology can be. We can see also how easily it can be abused. We can see the worries that countries have that harms occur in this platform. And they struggle to figure out what to do about it. And in fact, it's creating a kind of a digital sovereignty attitude where close the borders, get control over anything crossing the borders, and creating what in effect is a really messy jurisdictional situation that derives from the Westphalian model of the world. And the thing that I believe that the I&J network, policy network has achieved is to create discussion about how to create a much more collaborative environment than the one which we seem to be aimed at right now because people don't know what else to do. So the toolkits in particular are illustrative of actions that we can take in order to make parallel jurisdictions, let me say, compatible and interoperable. It's a term which is vital to the technical side of the internet. Now, institutionally speaking, I think we have done fairly well from the internet point of view in terms of developing standards, in terms of coping, for example, with critical need like unique identifiers. So ICANN, for instance, is one. We have the Internet Engineering Task Force. We have the World Wide Web Consortium. We have other activities of the IEEE and the ITU that deal with technical standards and their application. What we don't have, and what the I&J network provides, is a venue in which we can take concrete consideration of how we deal with legal issues across those boundaries, whether it's a trade issue or a law enforcement issue or standards for making digital signatures viable and have standing in various courts when there are contractual disputes and things like that. So the importance of the new toolkits, I think, could not be overstated because it makes concrete what has up until now been merely a matter of discussion. I have some examples of things that I think would be important, but I want to stop to give Stefan and you an opportunity to weigh in. I think we should touch on places that still need attention that are not yet addressed by the toolkits, in addition to observing the toolkits themselves and what good they can do. So I'll stop there, but thank you for letting me intervene for so long.
Oh, thank you very much, Vint. And it's actually a nice segue, and we'll have the opportunity, I hope, to come a little bit back and forth, even if the time is short. But I want to go to Stefan now, because digital cooperation has been put very high on the international agenda because of the high-level panel of the UN Secretary General. And many in this room know that Germany has been actually one of the two co-champions on the part of digital cooperation report that deals with the institutional framework and the tools that we are using for this. And we actually did with you those two consultations with Latin America and Africa on this notion. So you followed these issues very closely, and the question I wanted to ask you here is: the visibility is growing at the international level of the topic. More and more actors, not only in governments but also international organizations, are dealing with this. Is this just a good thing, or are there elements that may increase tensions around those issues and making them maybe harder to solve, or at least solve them in the appropriate way?
Yeah, thank you very much, dear Bertrand, Vincent, Henriette, Esterhuizen. It's a great pleasure. Let me say this at the beginning. It's a great pleasure and a great honor for me to be able to participate in such a high-level discussion with such relevant players. Yes, indeed, Bertrand, I think we all agree that the starting and landing point for digital cooperation is always the Internet Governance Forum. And if we do so, there are the consensus that the digital cooperation must be multi-stakeholder based. At the same time, we have noticed, and you mentioned it, that the vast majority of stakeholders, and indeed I am talking about all stakeholders, would like to see certain further developments in the existing IGF structure, such as more relevance, more political visibility, shorter path or bridge between discussion and decision, and a better connection of existing discussions in order to create synergies. This is at least what we as representatives of the German federal government have taken away as the so-called co-champion in the follow-up process on recommendations 5A and 5B of the report of the high-level panel on digital cooperation. Bertrand de la Chapelle, you conducted these consultations together with us, with different stakeholder consultations in Africa and Latin America. This is, to my understanding, the state of play. We have to proceed carefully here because we are walking a very, very fine line. The multi-stakeholder, not binding, and the bottom-up character of internet governance and global digital cooperation should and must be endangered under any circumstances. Therefore, the whole thing is demanding. Change is needed, but that does not mean that everything has to be done differently from the ground up. You all know the saying, only those who change remain true to themselves. In this sense, we need an update and upgrade IGF, as is already being discussed intensively as a IGF Plus. But this is not about overcoming the IGF. On the contrary, it's about strengthening the IGF as a central discussion platform for all stakeholders around the world. And according to the community, this could or maybe even should include a new multi-stakeholder high-level body. And this body should be an integral part of the IGF ecosystem and thus closely linked to the MAC, represent all stakeholder groups, enable and enrich the discussion, and enhance better exchanges between decision makers and IGF discussions. This could contribute to a higher profile of the IGF and thus lead to an increased perceptibility of the internet governance debates while preserving, and this is important, the bottom-up and flexible nature of the current IGF. In principle, this is to be supported, but dangers lurk here too. It's important to oppose by all means anything that wants to turn this multi-stakeholder body into a multilateral discussion-making forum. Even an IGF Plus has to remain a discussion body. And the high level and credibility of the MAC and its contributions, and here I am virtually looking over to Henriette Esterhuizen, must be respected and maintained in any kind of update structures. We will clearly oppose any attempts to abuse the proposed multi-stakeholder high-level body as a gateway for the multilateralism of internet governance and global digital cooperation. Last but not least, the internet has become society's operating system. We feel this more and more in the current pandemic situation. Accordingly, we need comprehensive and nuanced discussions of all actors involved. Business, civil society, technical community, and politics must sit down at the same table. And very often, Bertrand, it is the Internet in Jurisdiction Policy Network that facilitates these kinds of discussions. It helps to break down silos, connecting instead of dividing. This is the motto here. And the toolkits, which we will discuss today, are further examples of this value of this work. So I'm looking forward to the further discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for highlighting so clearly the challenges of walking the fine line between the competing interests or the desires and the tension between the desire to be efficient and have things that are applicable and having the discussion that is sufficiently open. And thank you both for the kind words. Actually, it's great in terms of order because Henriette, you've been both in APC when you were the executive director, but also now as the chair of the MAG. You've been involved in those issues of internet governance for many years. I mean, dating back to the first session of the World Summit on the Information Society back in 2002, 2003. And so, given your position today and this past experience, what I want to ask you is, how do you see the evolution? How do you see the current state of the debate about digital cooperation? What is improving? What is still difficult? And are there things that are going towards more tension, because that's the nuanced vision that I wanted to mention. But we have a period of review, and it's important to take that in perspective when we're thinking about where we're going now.
Thanks, Bertrand, and thanks to Vint and to Stefan. It's an honor to be sharing this platform with you. Well, I think the first part of my response, Bertrand, is that when you compare the state of global cooperation and internet governance and internet development with that of global cooperation in the response to the pandemic, I think internet governance is actually doing fairly well. In the case of the pandemic, we haven't seen an effective global response, and yet it's the greatest global challenge of recent times. With the distribution of vaccines, what we've seen is a me first, to quote the World Health Organization, response from rich countries, which has resulted in the bulk of available vaccines at the moment being administered in the world's 10 richest countries. We see pharmaceutical companies reluctant to share patents, which would allow local manufacturing and distribution of vaccines. And I think in spite of the efforts by the World Health Organization, and I think by many individual scientists and healthcare practitioners to collaborate, what we've really seen is a very nation-based response to a truly global threat. And we've seen how this does not work. So I think this does make internet look good, but it also, I think, should stand as a warning for the future of internet governance. I think what we've achieved in internet governance, firstly, we have a very robust interconnected network across border global public resource, which in fact has been such a source of resilience during this global crisis that I think we should all feel proud to be part of that. And I want to call out particularly the technical community, because I think we often underestimate how important the work is that they do. But we also have institutions that bring together different stakeholders to tackle specific aspects of internet policy and regulation, globally and regionally. And we have a tradition of robust debate about the role of different stakeholders, about some of the contested areas of jurisdiction, as the work that you've done, and also about the impact of aspects of the internet on public and political life. For example, the debate that we're having about the role of social networking platforms during elections. And I think what we also have is a very broad community of diverse actors and institutions that can take forward this work. And I want to name all the institutions, you know who they are, but we also have the IGF, we have national and regional IGFs, we have the roadmap that Stefan has mentioned, the roadmap for digital cooperation, and we have the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network's new toolkits. Now, I'm not claiming that what we have is perfect. I think that internet governance is an evolving landscape, and I think there are many challenges. I think the greatest challenge is the backdrop of social and economic inequality, which continues to undermine achieving universal and meaningful access to the internet. And I think there are emerging challenges of regulatory responses. How do we achieve the level of market regulation that can ensure open and fair competition, and levels of content regulation and regulation of harmful behavior without restricting the internet's power for innovation and for enabling human rights, particularly freedom of expression and opinion? These are not trivial challenges, and I think that they'll be maintaining. They'll even grow in the coming years. But I think what we have demonstrated, and I think your work really does demonstrate this, is that we can take on these challenges. And if we do so, not through rose-tinted rhetoric of multi-stakeholderism, but actually through a very rigorous application of the multi-stakeholder approach that looks at the roles of different stakeholders, at responses from states, at participation, at the role of business, but also at the role of the technical community and also of civil society in maintaining levels of accountability openness in how we address these challenges. And I think also the role of intergovernmental organizations. I think what we've achieved in internet governance, I think, is a recognition that we need multi-stakeholder approaches, but we also need to work with national institutions, with national governance processes, and with intergovernmental multilateral institutions. And then I think we also have established, and again, you see this in the work of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, that all of what we do, and as we explore the internet governance challenges that we need to explore, we have to maintain awareness of this backdrop of upholding human rights, and to refer back to the WSIS, which you mentioned, the World Summit on the Information Society, and achieving people-centered development. So not trivial, but I think we have evidence of the possibility of achieving concrete, positive results in doing so. And I think the toolkit that we're about to learn more about is one such example of evidence. Thanks very much for Bertrand and everyone else.
Thank you, Henriette. And it's a pity. I wish we wanted to have a short segment to keep the overall agenda. So I would have loved to continue the discussion, because there are many things that Stefan, Vint, and Henriette have mentioned. But one of the things that I think is important to think about is when Henriette says that these things are not trivial. Vint had written in one of the articles on the occasion of the second global conference that we organized in Ottawa. He wrote an article in the Financial Times, I think, that mentioned that basically addressing the policy issues around the internet is basically more complex than inventing the internet itself. And that resonates very much with what Henriette was saying. Second thing is that this is something that is in the making. It may be not trivial, but it is in the making. And I just want to add one element, which is that I hate polarization in general terms, and that's something that whenever we use the term nuance, that's what we mean in the I&J Policy Network. And there's one dimension of nuance here, which is the necessity of making the actors collaborate, including the existing international institutions with the different other actors. And this is the reason why from the onset, the I&J Policy Network has included the secretariats of international organizations as full stakeholders, not as just observers on the side, but as full stakeholders, as participants. And the reason why we have those institutional supporting the institutional support of 6 international organizations for the global conferences. But to finish this segment and move to the substance of the toolkit and the topics, I want to go back to what Paul was mentioning regarding the fact that how the toolkits have been developed is almost as important as the outcome itself. And I like to quote Jean Monnet, who was the creator or the initiator of the European Union, who basically said that nothing can be done without humans or without people, but nothing is durable without institutions. And one of the things that we're confronted with is to invent, at the same time that we are addressing the concrete issues, to invent the methodology through which we address the problems. And I want to highlight that for us as Secretariat, the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network is about addressing concrete issues and about trying to develop, in cooperation with the different actors, the ways to address those issues. The next segment will actually describe the 3 very concrete issues that have been chosen by the members of the policy network and that have emerged progressively as the focus of the discussion. One thing that is very important is that you cannot move forward in internet governance without doing things on an issue-by-issue basis, because the stakeholders that are related to a particular issue are sometimes different from the other ones. And that's the way we have built the different contact groups that are dealing with those things. And you will have the opportunity in the next segment to hear from the people who are driving this work as coordinators or participating in the contact groups, why the topics that have been chosen matter, and what was their personal experience about participating in this work and dedicating time. I mention this because this is about people. This is about the society we want to build, and the solutions that we're trying to find are basically about enabling this society to function correctly. The third segment will be about the actual content of the toolkits, and we'll come back to that later. But I wanted at that stage, before handing over to Sophie, to mention one important thing. The production and the methodology to produce those toolkits is not the negotiation by representatives of particular organizations of a document that will have binding force. It is, on the contrary, the coming together in a safe space of individuals from these different entities who try collaboratively to identify what can make things work better. It doesn't mean that there's an endorsement, that there is a binding agreement of any sort. It is a best effort to provide something that we and they hope can be useful for everyone. And I'll come back to that a little bit later in a particular dimension. So with that, I hand over to Sophie.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. So yes, so let's start with the Domains and Jurisdiction Programme Contact Group. And we're here today with Brian Symbolic, who's the Vice President and General Counsel of the Public Interest Registry, and he's the Contact Group Coordinator. And we're also here with Ashley Heineman, who's the Global Policy Director of GoDaddy. So Brian and Ashley, could you tell us why the topics addressed in the contact group are important, and also why I&J's work is useful to you both as professionals working in this space? And perhaps, Brian, we could start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Sophie. So to me, the work of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, the Domains and Jurisdiction Track or Contact Group, has been really critically important to advancing discussions and advancing important topics in meaningful ways. The work in particular a few years ago of the operational approaches that the contact group has put out has really served as a foundational document for all conversations that revolve around the issues that arise when you're using the DNS to address abuses of either a technical nature or of a content nature. And there's a word that has been repeated several times so far that I would really like to reiterate, and it sort of helps embody my interest in what I&J is doing, and that's the concept of nuance, that the domains by nature are sort of a binary state of existence when you're talking about operators like registries and registrars. Either the domains resolve or they don't. And so because of that necessity and that fundamental piece of information, there is oftentimes a black and white approach from various points of view on this. And I&J makes sure to introduce in a very thoughtful, balanced way the insertion of nuance into dealing with these topics, into the effect of using the DNS to address potential harms online, the collateral damage that can be caused by taking such action, but then on the other side, the potential harm that can be caused if action is not taken. So the very thoughtful and nuanced approach of I&J in this regard has been critically important to me and to advancing these sorts of discussions in a very meaningful way across many different stakeholders and in various fora.
Thanks a lot, Brian. And Ashley, could you tell us a bit about why you find the work of the contact group helpful?
So yeah, this is Ashley Heineman from GoDaddy, and I will be speaking largely as a contributor to the process, whereas Brian was leading it and a contributor. And I think, what the greatest value for me is that we're in an environment, and Bertrand mentioned this, a safe environment. I think that's a good way to characterize it. We're here to think outside the box without the, feeling the need to focus on entrenched positions or in a defensive posture. We're here to think outside the box. We're here to be forward looking with the premise that we understand that abuse, whether it's technical abuse or content abuse, is a problem. And what is it we can do as companies, as a community, to address it without the fear of reprisal or having to, again, go back to kind of our entrenched positions and being defensive. I think it's also a great opportunity to educate ourselves, whether it's us as the companies involved or the ones who are notifying us of problems they're seeing in this space, because there's a lot of nuance to build off of what Brian just said to the problems that we're facing and how we address them. So through these toolkits, we're able to articulate what are the different options available to companies and what impacts do taking those actions have. And they're quite significant. So I think having the opportunity to detail these through the toolkits, I think provides a perspective, not only on how to address the problem, but as to why we tend to take the positions we do and the actions we do and the actions we don't take. Because again, and as you'll see in the toolkits, we're very limited in what we can do as registries and registrars. They have great impact once those actions are taken. And while there might be people out there that would like us to do more, I think reading the toolkits lets them see why we do things the way we do. But I think the ability to have these documents, to share them broadly, to share them with other governments, to share them with other communities, to use it as a basis to build off of. I think Bertrand mentioned this earlier. This is not, one and done. This is an evolution in how we think and how we approach and address with these real world issues. And I think it's also helpful that we can bring together not just, the GTLD perspective, but the country code perspective. These are all, things that need to be taken into account and perhaps didn't fit in neatly and say, I can, but do here. But I'll stop there. I think that's enough of an introduction as to how I find it useful. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashley and Brian. That was really helpful. So we'll now move on to the Data and Jurisdiction Contact Group. And we're here with Robert Young, who's the legal counsel at Canada's Department of Global Affairs, and also Lynn Mayan, who is the executive director of the Asia Cloud Computing Association and managing director of TRPC. So thank you both so much for being here. And perhaps we could start with you, Robert. So why would you say cross-border access to electronic evidence is a key challenge in today's digital world? And you as a coordinator of the contact group, why do you dedicate all the time that you do to work on this at I&J?
Thanks very much, Sophie, and greetings to everyone from Ottawa, Canada. Hello, bonjour, hotzo, habari, hola, guten tag, and more. I think to answer the second question, well, sometimes I ask myself that. Occasionally our meetings are very late at night or early in the morning because of the global nature of our data group. I'm looking at Mayan, who is often up very late at night to be able to meet with us, which speaks to the commitment of her, but also of so many of our contact group members. But for me, it really comes down to two things. The issues are pressing and all around us. Our work has focused in the data group chiefly on cross-border access to data and to advance criminal law investigation and prosecution. So everybody wants to see crime reduced. Everyone wants to see those responsible held accountable. Everyone wants to see their country being more safe. But pretty well everyone, and I can say everyone involved in our data group, wants to see that done in ways that respects human rights, privacy, and follows or extends, if you like, the rules-based international order that is so important in many of our societies. And so the issues are relevant more than ever, even in the time since we've started our work. Think about negotiations of the Budapest Protocol the new protocol to the Budapest Convention dealing with electronic evidence. Think of the developments in Europe with the e-evidence proposals. Think of the US Cloud Act, but think also of the thousands and thousands of criminal cases that are sometimes slowed because of delays in getting access to to evidence that would help create criminal accountability. But think also, as Vint mentioned off the top, of the different ways in which data and cross-border access to data can undermine rules, can undermine privacy. Our work is urgent.
Thank you so much, Robert. And now I'll go to Mayan. So what would you say in terms of your involvement in as a contact group member of the data program?
Greetings everybody from tomorrow. It is actually Friday where I am in Singapore. So I live in the future. Welcome. It's we still have COVID here, unfortunately. The contact group has been really interesting, and it's really important for me, at least, because I feel that a lot of the work that we do answers really valid questions. When I go, and I'm an active policymaker, I'm an active lobbyist, when I go in and chat with the policymakers and governments, they are asking these questions. How do we get this information? What are due processes? And a lot of the work that I do within Asia Pacific represent a lot of the work that I do in Asia Pacific, it comes from jurisdictions who don't really have very strong processes in place just yet. I want to say just yet. I know some people will tell you they don't have it at all, but it's also just yet. So I feel that a lot of the work that we're doing has been really meaningful because they really do answer very valid questions which are coming in fast and furious from all of the jurisdictions which are surrounding me right now.
Thank you both so much. And it's true, your different time zones are really highlighting how much time you do spend to I&J. So thank you both so much for your work. So now we'll go to the content and jurisdiction contact group. And we're here with Wolfgang Schultz, who's the director of the Alexander von Humboldt Institute for Internet and Society. And he's the coordinator of the contact group. And also we're here with Hawley Johnson from Columbia University's Global Freedom of Expression Project. So welcome to you both. Thank you for being here. And Wolfgang, could we start with you, and could you tell us about the topics addressed in the contact group and why the work is important?
So we have a huge range of topics we were discussing, and one we have discussed a lot is the geographical scope of decisions in this field. And why is that so important? I would like to come back to the discussion we had at the very beginning of this webinar. I personally believe that we are at the verge of, in content regulation, of completely new territory. We have an overlapping of state governance and private governance. And there is a vacuum of tools and institutions here to deal with that. And that becomes more and more apparent every day, I would say. And the work we are doing in this field is extremely important here in many ways. And one way is, has been mentioned already, that we have created a safe space where people can just test ideas or share problems they would not share in public. And so we can already anticipate maybe some conflicts that will emerge and can discuss and maybe find solutions there. And the second one is that in this field of content and jurisdiction, pragmatic tools that work are extremely important, because it's very, very unlikely that you will in some fields where the government systems are so different and the approaches of countries are so different, that you will really come up with a agreement that settles the problem. So you need something that really helps the actors dealing with this problem. So that's what we try to do in these fields of notifications. How should they look like? Recourse mechanisms, and as I said, people who decide about geographical scope of content restrictions, what's pragmatic approach, the human rights-based pragmatic approach to these issues. I think that's why this work of the group is so important, and that's why we all dedicate time and energy. And I can share with you that the discussions are intense. It's not just that we have a text and say, okay, let's have it this way, but it's a really intense discussion, and this has to be, and it becomes more and more intense the more we come to tackle the questions that really matter.
Thank you very much for that, Wolfgang. And Hawley, over to you. Do you want to explain a bit about why you engage and find the work useful?
Sure. On a personal level, and this may be because I'm a traumatized American after the last few years, but my main concern is really about the sustainability of democracy in light of the rise of populist nationalism and authoritarianism. Unfortunately, we've been witnessing how the hopes of the internet of being a democratizing and unifying force is now turned into a great fear of how it's sowing divisions, becoming a tool for disinformation rather than truth, which is, really undermining our collective security, stability, and ultimately our sanity. And on a professional level, here at Columbia Global Freedom of Expression, we monitor legal trends and emerging global norms in freedom of expression. And one of the foundational concepts for freedom of expression in democracy is the marketplace of ideas. That more speech is going to lead to truth and rational minds will prevail. But right now we're seeing that marketplace is really broken. We're experiencing significant market failures. And I'm here really to help find solutions to those failures. We've seen disinformation not only in the United States, creating really segments of the population that are living in alternate universes of conspiracy theories, but we're seeing that in other countries as well. There are legal tools that can be applied, and I think there's some very important court cases in the US that are being prosecuted now. But that has to happen on so many different levels by so many different actors. It just all can't go to the courts. And I think that's what's so important about this group. Our group is critical for exploring collective solutions to these problems internationally and across sectors. And how can we put up guardrails that are going to protect the free flow of ideas and information without us all falling off a cliff?
Thank you so much, Hawley. So as everyone can see, the I&J programs deal with very specific and concrete topics, but I'd now like to bring Bertrand in to share some of the cross-cutting elements.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie. Actually, I would like, before going to the cross-cutting elements, maybe I have a few additional remarks to the presenters here. One, maybe I'd like to ask Brian. You mentioned the work that is being done and the interactions within the group, but I understand that some of the outcomes, either formal outcomes, but also individual outcomes that you pick from the work itself, has been useful for you for some of the activities beyond that, initiatives like the framework or the Dns Abuse Institute. So can you say a few words about that? Because we see this work, and that includes the toolkit, as stepping stones and launch pads and things that would allow to build a broader ecosystem of people using those things and expanding on them while we continue the work. So can you say a few words about this?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Bertrand. And yeah, as I mentioned, I really see the work of Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network as foundational, and in that it advances the discussion and allows for iteration in a really important way. So one of the documents that you mentioned, the Framework to Address Abuse, is a document that over 50 operators, both GTLD registry operators, CCTLD registry operators, as well as registrars, have signed on, that borrowed quite liberally and cited appropriately, of course, to the work of Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, especially from the operational approaches document, because it very clearly and in an approachable way explains the issues that are created when you're using the DNS to address both technical abuses and website content issues. And also in not some sort of binary way where it is you do or you don't, but rather having an approach and a mindset that allows for creation of thresholds for action, so that when you would have an otherwise potentially inappropriate step of using the DNS to address these things, when the scale of harms gets to an articulated, a great enough level, then all of a sudden it may become appropriate. And so that thoughtful and nuanced approach allowed for the creation of the framework to address abuse. And also, as you mentioned, PIR, the company I work for, we're the registry operator of .org, clearly as what's behind me. We've created what we're calling the Dns Abuse Institute, which focuses using the language from I&J on technical abuses, and really is meant to to build upon the work of the I&J of the contact group, and really take things down even a level further to get tools into the hands, much like the toolkits that I&J is launching today, and get those in the hands of operators to put them in the best position to help quickly remediate technical abuses of the DNS.
Thank you, Brian. And I had a message directly to me. Vint unfortunately has to leave us because of another appointment in a few minutes. But I understand that he was willing to make a few suggestions that could help us also in the path moving forward. So Vint, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Bertrand. I appreciate the accommodation. First of all, this has been a strikingly valuable discussion so far. These concrete examples of things we could do to cooperate are far beyond the speculative discussions that we've had in the past. So I was going to mention a couple of other things we might try to work on, one of which is to determine how to make digital signatures have adequate standing in courts of law across jurisdictional boundaries. And so how does a digital signature get assigned? How does the PKI get generated? We have to come to some agreements about whether these signatures have standing. And so that's one very concrete thing we might consider working on. We have an interesting problem with digital identity. It's a subject of constant debate and discussion. And what is of value and concern, of course, is how one could be identified in a federated environment let's say, in a way which is strongly authenticated. This is not an argument that everyone in the world should only get on the net if they are strongly identified, but rather there are times when you want yourself to be as strongly authenticated as possible so no one else can pretend to be you. So coming to agreement about the mechanisms for achieving this kind of identity, I think, would be another example of a toolkit worthy of our attention. There are many more, and I just want to point out, as I listened to Stefan's comments on the IGF+, the whole history of internet is about creating new institutions when the need for them has arisen. So we never started out with all of them. There are many, dozens of them, scores of them now. But as the need arises, this community recognizes the creation of institution at need. And here we are, in a sense, creating institutions and also tools for those institutions to use. So thank you so much, Bertrand, for allowing me a moment. Thank you all for participating. Keep working. This is turning out to be a very, very concrete and, in my view, valuable contribution to the internet's future evolution. So I wish you all well in the rest of the discussions. And of course, I'll see you on the net.
Yeah, thank you, Vint. And obviously, there's no lack of topics to address, but these ones that you mentioned are at the frontier of the technical infrastructure and the policy element in a perfect example of the interfacing that happens. We are welcoming actually additional topics if people in the community identify something and want to raise their hand and maybe take an inspiration. I'm just going off script here, taking an inspiration of the way the IETF works. The policy network is something that has been driven in part at the initial steps because of the resources by the Secretariat in picking the topics. The way the IETF works, and also the World Wide Web Consortium, by that matter, is also to use the notion of birds of a feather. And we hope that in due time, when there is a topic that emerges and that people in the network are really caring about a particular issue, they can raise their hand, launch a call for input or a call for interest in the community and gather and make the issue framing document that allows the discussion to move forward. So this is going to be the next steps, but we see now an emergence of a desire by a certain number of actors, and you're just an example here, additional one, of expecting that I&J can help frame a topic and then potentially lead to other activities afterwards. Framing is fundamental. So thank you, Vin. And I want to come back quickly to maybe Robert and Wolfgang. Robert, you mentioned in passing the different initiatives that are taking place, and for people in the audience who are maybe not completely familiar with the question of electronic evidence, the key issue is under which condition can law enforcement in one country actually request from a company that is based in another country information about a user when there is a criminal investigation. What are the rules that apply? What are the procedures? So you mentioned different initiatives. Can you just highlight a little bit the challenge of the interoperability between those different processes and whether they are, how those different silos are functioning together or not functioning, and in which regard the work or the existence of the contact group allows to connect those processes, including for somebody like you who follows all of them.
Sure. Thanks, Bertrand. It's kind of hard to be brief because everything is so integrated. But in a nutshell, I'll give you from Canada, from the government of Canada. We're at the table in Strasbourg and now virtually reinforcing the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which has about 60 member states, most of which are active in the negotiation of a new protocol. That treaty is gaining more states, including states outside of Europe, every month, every year. But it's not universal yet. Meanwhile, at the UN, there's an initiative to create a global cybercrime treaty. We haven't had our first meeting on that yet, but that's supposed to happen later this year. American colleagues and others will know about the US Cloud Act, which allows for the creation of bilateral agreements between the US and trusted partners to expedite access to digital evidence. Of course, the existing system of mutual legal assistance, or MLA, works very well around the world, but it's a web of almost an uncountable number of agreements and treaties between different states and so on. And those agreements about mutual legal assistance largely predate the wide existence day of digital evidence. So mutual legal assistance works well, but it wasn't designed for the volume or the nature of digital evidence. And so MLA requests often take months and months when a request passes from one country to another. And law enforcement needs faster access. So it's very complicated. As I said, from the point of view of Canada, we're involved in these different files in different directions. We're involved in internet and jurisdiction. I say we because multiple federal ministries of Canada are involved in different parts of I&J. My colleague Karen Odsent from the Department of Justice and I are in the data stream, the data group, but others are in other groups. But we're involved because at the I&J table, we spend time virtually of late with experts, stakeholders who are involved in all of these processes we've mentioned and many more. So getting to talk about digital evidence crossing borders with a group that includes a prosecutor from Brazil, a public policy advocate from Singapore, leading academics from Australia, experts from Brussels, the leading think tanks, authors, civil society advocates, Microsoft, Shopify. I can't name everyone in our group, leading experts from German, from industry, but have a look on the I&J website to see the diverse membership of our group. Getting that group together, many of us in different ways involved in these different processes, and talking about the commonalities and trying to find some coherent, elegant guidance and direction about how to crack the different nuts is time very well spent.
Thank you very much, Robert. I think it's an important element regarding the expression was mentioned of valid question and intense interactions. I think it is striking, as I've been following the different work streams, to see how even for people who have been dealing with some of those issues for several years and sometimes from decades, sometimes the interaction between the different categories of actor allows to understand a particular issue at a much deeper level that was not understood with all their consequences. And as a final element before we move to the next segment, Wolfgang, I cannot resist the opportunity to allow you to elaborate very briefly, but to nonetheless mention what you have often described in the contact group of the importance of agreeing on vocabulary, because I think it's a very important point, and I'd like the opportunity for you to mention that.
Yeah, thank you, Bertrand. So I think in the content group, or in the realm of content governance, there has been for years a problem that people are talking about something, but they don't really understand each other because they do not really talk about the same issue. We have so many different types of content conflicts that even a taxonomy that helps us to say we are talking about this right now, not about these other things which are interesting as well, but just having a kind of category system, what are we actually talking about, is in itself extremely valuable. And that's something I think we have understood in this group, and we do not aim at coming up with normative standards. Maybe that at a time and for a specific problem that's possible, but it's extremely helpful already to have this guideline, this taxonomy available, and move on to the next level, which is when there is somebody making a decision, a court, for example. The courts have not so much been part of the conversation about internet governance, but they make extremely important interventions when it comes to content. When there is a judge deciding within the scope of his or her legal system, then to give guidance, what could be within this way to decide, that is something which where we find the most value in that, and that's a lot. I see that there is need for that, and as I said at my first statement, we are reaching kind of next level multi-stakeholderism, because I think it is necessary to have institutions where you can refer to for these kind of problems. There is a need for that, and when we can be part of that, then I think it's great.
Thank you. I always like to remind people that you joke that taxonomies can save the world, and actually having common formulations for things that we have in common as a problem is important. Thank you all. I'm going to make a quick transition to the next thing with one important element. One of the benefits of having 3 programs is that we as Secretariat can see threads across those 3 programs, things that are cross-cutting. I won't elaborate on this. I just want to mention 2 things. The first thing is that the direct interactions between public authorities in one country and private actors in another country are exploding. It can be through regulations that have extraterritorial impact, or it can be through day-to-day interactions through requests for electronic evidence, for taking down a domain name, for taking down a particular piece of content. And in both cases, both for extraterritorial regulation and the GDPR, but also on a day-to-day basis, procedures matter immensely. They matter both in terms of the guarantees for human rights and protections and the rule of law and due process, but they also matter at the day-to-day level to ensure that that the relationships between people and institutions and organizations are fluid, that people understand what the others are wanting, that there is a mention that a request has been received, that there is a mention of a format for the way to submit something. And so procedural arrangements, as you will see further and will discover when you look at the toolkits, those elements of procedural mechanisms are intended and are extremely important when we're dealing with these interactions between actors who are not traditionally interacting directly in this way. And this is a paradigm shift that we're trying to address. The second thing is the notion of normative plurality. What is striking when we deal with transnational issues and the overlapping of jurisdiction is the diversity of actors who are actually in position to set, to implement, and to enforce some sort of norms. It is the states, of course. It can be sometimes in federal governments, state level, like California adopting a regulation on privacy, for instance. But it is also the private actors increasingly through the terms of service that they're adopting that sometimes regulate, for instance, a significant part of freedom of expression for a community of several billion people. And so this normative plurality is actually raising an important question of the distribution of responsibilities between the different actors in terms of setting the rules, implementing them, and enforcing them. And there is a modus operandi that needs to be developed, so the mutual affirmation of commitments regarding the distribution of responsibilities. So those are two elements that are cross-cutting. There are several others regarding how do you notify a user that an action has been taken, what are the mechanisms for recourse in all those cases, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to belabor, but there are very interesting cross-fertilization between the three programs. But the final point, as a matter of transition, is you will find in the toolkits that are going to be presented in the next segment elements that will help people developing frameworks, lawmakers, people developing their terms of service, people having to adopt common rules or codes of conduct. There are other elements that will be useful for people who have to make granular decisions on a content restriction, a court, etc. But there are also things, and I really want to emphasize this, that are things that can be adopted unilaterally by the different actors to fluidify and to simplify the interactions between the different actors in a field that is emerging. And this fluidification is important for predictability, for growing trust between the different actors, and for something that is more efficient and at the same time rights protecting. So I really encourage you to look at those toolkits, not only at the level of principles or even the criteria that will help you make individual decisions, but also in terms of what you can do on an individual basis unilaterally that will make the system work better. And so with that, I am fundamentally giving it back to Sophie for the transition to the presentation of the actual toolkit.
Thank you very much, Bertrand. So yes, let's now have the presentations of the toolkits. So as we've mentioned during the event, these toolkits have been developed through an iterative process, starting with the first global conference of the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network in 2016. The toolkits themselves include an introduction to this methodology, and we're going to show a slide that sketches out the different stages that have led to this toolkit today. So first of all, as you can see, the framing of the issues and the common problems among stakeholders is a very important first step. Secondly, setting the common objectives for the policy actors. And then thirdly, developing some operational approaches. And then, as we're sharing with you, producing tools to foster legal interoperability in the form of practical outcomes. This is explained in more detail in the toolkits themselves, so I encourage you to take a look. And this is the methodology that I&J is continuously using to address new topics. Within each of these stages actually has also been an intensely interactive process, as we've heard, contact group members, dedicated working groups, hours of virtual meetings, calls for input, comment, and validation of the different work projects. So I'll now give the floor to Ajit Francis, who's I&J's Policy Programs Manager, to provide more information on this and also present the toolkit on cross-border access to electronic evidence. Thanks, Ajit.
Thank you, Sophie. It is a privilege to present the work of the Data and Jurisdiction Contact Group that has culminated in this toolkit. According to an EU report, based on data from member states and providers' transparency reports, electronic evidence in any form is relevant in about 85% of total criminal investigations in the EU. In almost 2/3 of these investigations, a request to service providers based in another jurisdiction is needed. As a result, 55% of total investigations in the EU require cross-border access to electronic evidence, and this trend is expected to accelerate further. Additionally, access to electronic evidence is increasingly touted as a justification and rationale for data localization drives in many parts of the world. Countries like India have already put in place localization of all financial payments related data within its jurisdiction. In the absence of rights-respecting frameworks that facilitate seamless access to electronic evidence with sufficient regard for users' rights, there is a risk of proliferation of such data localization measures that may put the cross-border nature of the internet in jeopardy. Traditional mechanisms for such access are based upon state-to-state cooperation involving mutual legal assistance treaties. They are time-consuming, overwhelmed, and often add a layer of imbalance as they apply the legal standards of the country where the service provider is incorporated to requests made by another country, even when the victims and suspects may be located in the country that is requesting such information. It is in this context that the Data and Jurisdiction Program and the Contact Group have focused on the topic of cross-border access to electronic evidence and on the identification of appropriate due process guarantees and safeguards that are applicable when requests and orders are made directly to service providers instead of using the MLAT route. Such mechanisms can complement mutual legal assistance treaties, but are not intended to replace them. Increasingly, there are also many regimes such as the US-UK bilateral agreement under the Cloud Act, the EU's e-evidence proposal, and the second additional protocol to the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, to name a few, that are contemplating and implementing mechanisms that allow law enforcement agencies to make requests and orders directly to service providers. However, there exist certain uncertainties on the practical implementation of many of these regimes, as well as the substantive safeguards that they put in place. And the work of the Contact Group and this toolkit seeks to provide a multi-stakeholder baseline for the distribution of responsibilities across actors in the protection of users' rights, as well as increasing efficiency in access to electronic evidence to facilitate investigations around the world. This toolkit, which compiles and organizes the different outcomes that the Contact Group has produced over the last 4 years, is organized around 2 tracks. The first part, as you see on the screen, is titled General Structure and Key Regime Components for Accessing Electronic Evidence. And the second part focuses on voluntary disclosure. The first part explores the general structure of such regimes where law enforcement can make requests and orders directly to service providers and identifies the different components that make up such a regime. These components and their subsequent definitions are included in the first tool on general regime architecture. This list of components is a very useful grid of analysis for understanding how different regimes around the world deal with access and their corresponding thresholds and standards for due process. This section also includes two sets of multi-stakeholder recommendations dealing with regime standards and request order standards. Regime standards cover how these components may be tailored to develop a rights-respecting regime by focusing on the scope of such regimes with respect to the data and crimes that fall within its purview, the level of public authorities that may be involved in the production of such requests and orders, the responsibilities of service providers, and the implications on users' right to recourse and remedies. On the other hand, request order standards provide recommendations and suggestions for the process of transmission of such requests, the minimum notice components or information that should be included in a request or order, and how to identify and demonstrate substantive elements like nexus to the data being requested and substantial connection to a crime. We hope that this general structure and key regime components section provides actors with a framework to approach cross-border access to electronic evidence and understand the different elements of a regime and its implications on actors. The second part of the toolkit on voluntary disclosure focuses on the situation where many service providers, when not explicitly prohibited by law, voluntarily provide foreign law enforcement agencies with electronic evidence on a case-by-case basis, depending on the merits of a request. Towards making this tool more accessible to states that might not be covered by existing regimes and to empower service providers limited by resources, this section documents a set of suggestions that can improve the process of making requests by states and handling and processing requests by service providers. This is based on the general regime architecture that was introduced in the previous section of the toolkit and is adapted to voluntary disclosure. This latter part of this section of the toolkit adopts the minimum notice components for general regime side of the toolkit in order to provide guidance on what information should be communicated to service providers as part of voluntary disclosure requests. These are very practical tools that have been developed by members of the contact group from the 6 stakeholder groups. And we hope that these tools provide stakeholders, especially civil society and academia, with a grid of analysis with which to understand and evaluate the components of such cross-border regimes and their scope, while also raising awareness on such mechanisms. It also provides information to countries on how regulations elsewhere make an impact on them and what kind of regulations and regimes they can develop on their own to facilitate cross-border access to electronic evidence while having due consideration for the rights of users. Similarly, they also provide concrete operational recommendations or suggestions, particularly for voluntary disclosure, which provides guidance for states and providers in respectively making and evaluating requests. Finally, it also informs policymakers that are working on the development of such cross-border mechanisms on the different components of a regime and their appropriate due process and safeguards. With this, I would like to invite those who are interested to learn more about the toolkit to join us in the breakout session on data and jurisdiction, where we will deep dive into the toolkit and answer any additional questions that you may have. At this point, I'd also like to hand over to my colleague, Frana Marajovic, the director of the Content and Jurisdiction Program, to walk us through the cross-border content moderation toolkit. Frana, over to you.
Thank you, Ajit, and thank you, everybody. Beforehand, especially to Holly and Wolfgang, who already gave us a flavor of what's in the Content and Jurisdiction Program and what is, in a way, part of the toolkit that we are presenting and discussing. Essentially, we are looking for solutions to managing globally available content in the light of the diversity of laws, norms, rules, standards that are today applicable on the internet. As was discussed and pointed out, governments around the world are increasingly legislating what content or behavior is acceptable or legal online. At the same time, internet intermediaries and platforms are looking for ways to address content which they do not want on their platforms or their service, or which might be illegal in a particular jurisdictions. We are in the Internet Jurisdiction Policy Network systematically monitoring these trends, and we have a database of cases which is constantly being updated, and I'll put in the chat a link to our retrospect database so you can also have a look. We also monitor these trends through our global and regional status reports. So this constant evolution of laws, rules, and regulation is creating a very complex framework for global availability of online content. In the absence of international arrangements, we are seeing very little harmonization or coherence between numerous legislative proposals, rules or regulations to address abuses. So, and this really seems to be a growing trend. I don't see that it's going to go the other way in terms of going for multilateralism. So in this kind of environment, complex environment, we need tools. We need tools that will enable or facilitate cooperation and harmonize due process mechanisms, and as was pointed out by Wolfgang and Holly, protect also human rights. And this is essentially the aim of these toolkit. In the Content and Jurisdiction program, we have a fantastic set of around 30 senior experts who work for governments, internet companies, technical operators, members of civil society, leading universities and international organizations. And as Bertrand pointed out, they work individually, well, collectively here as experts, but not institutional representatives. So we are trying to work together to define policy problems, to share knowledge and design common approaches to cross-border internet and find solutions that are not only helpful and functional, but also facilitate exchange of information and ideas, economy, trade, protect human rights, and at the end of the day, also strengthen our security. So these are the solutions that we are presenting to you as part of this toolkit. And to immediately put a caveat, this toolkit provides some of the answers to these common problems. It does not provide all solutions to cross-border internet and content moderations issues. As you can see on the structure of the toolkit on the slide, again, the toolkit is divided in two parts. The first section provides a framework for understanding and approaching the 4 stages of the content moderation process. And we divided it into identification, evaluation, choice of action, and of recourse. In this section, we have elements such as the list of normative bases for identification of content, whether it falls under the protection of international human rights treaties such as the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Convention of Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination, and so on. It also contains a framing paper on how much global agreement there is or coherence on illegality of certain type of content. And what I mean here, to take the most obvious example, there is very broad global coherence that CSAM, or child sexual exploitation images material, is so abhorrent it doesn't belong anywhere on the internet. So we can see that there is some kind of coherence on that type of content. On the other hand, on content or legislation that persecutes minorities, there is very little coherence. So the question is, how do you ensure harmonization, or what do you would take away from this particular concept? Consideration on timeliness are also important when it comes to content removal, as recent legislative efforts have put an increasing emphasis on short response times for removing specific types of content, in particular when it comes to terrorism and violent extremism content. We also have, as Wolfgang pointed out, a document on the very important topic of the geographic reach of content restrictions. As we are seeing increasingly cases where certain countries, either through legal or regulatory actions, are ordering global takedowns of content which may only be illegal in their own jurisdiction or not allowed in their own jurisdiction, but nevertheless it becomes unavailable globally. Offline, different countries or jurisdictions do not impose on others what is legal or permissible. So why should they by default impose their views globally online? So how can we work on this? How can we balance this out? So how can we find solutions where different actors determine the appropriate geographical reach of content decisions? And this is an important topic that we are working on and discussing, and it's also to an extent part of this toolkit. And the toolkit also addresses the needs for recourse mechanisms for decisions which are taken on the basis of the company's terms of service. In the sections, there are principles that can be helpful when it comes to establishing an independent recourse mechanisms created by one company, or principles for establishment of an independent self-regulatory bodies at the national level, which would take into account content moderation decisions by a number of different companies or actors. These are just some of the examples that I'm taking from the first section. The second section is much more focused on the practical tools which can help to resolve some of the challenges. Again, this was mentioned in the conversation between Wolfgang and Bertrand, that there is a clear need to develop a common vocabulary for what content, what we are talking about in many of these issues or many of these cases. So here as part of the toolkit, and I will mention Holly, who was very much involved or leading this process of determining a common vocabulary of what content might be illegal, harmful, and acceptable, either by legislation or companies' terms of service. So we have a typology of content for different situation and context. We also have in this section a list of notifiers. So who are the different entities that identify and inform of potentially illegal or content which might be violating companies' own terms of service? It's important that we know who we are talking about in these cases. We have a list of actions which are available to service providers to identify allegedly harmful or illegal content. We have a table listing information which should be provided by different notifiers, depending on whether they are individuals, whether they are trusted flaggers or public entities when requesting from internet companies to take action on online content. There is also a list of actions which are available to the platforms or intermediaries or states which needs to take action on allegedly harmful or illegal content. So this is important that it's a growing list of important elements of the taxonomies that are part of this conversation and that are helpful when it comes to different entities and different stakeholders to improve their own process. So this toolkit contains many of the elements which can be helpful to all the stakeholders to improve their own processes, but also to improve processes of cooperation and collaboration between themselves. We are looking at these processes, as was mentioned already, as a way of safeguarding due process, ensuring human rights, and providing a good and efficient way of moving forward in this current field. And I would encourage all of you to have a look at the toolkit and see if there's anything which could be useful in your work. And we would be very happy to discuss and engage how some of these elements could be helpful, or as it was mentioned also, to hear from you what could be important and useful in your work in order to be developed. The toolkit does not contain all the answers. There's plenty of work ahead of us in our contact group. And I invite you to join me in the breakout session after this event, where I can hopefully answer some of your questions, if not all of them, and give you more information and ideas about our future activities and our future plans when it comes to the content and jurisdiction group. So this is, I would say, a very brief introduction to this topic. See you in the breakout rooms, and I would pass the floor to my colleague, Elizabeth Besudi, who is the director of the Domains program. Liz?
Liz, are you muted?
It's one in every crowd. Yes. Forgive me. Hello, everybody. Thanks again for being here. Once again, my name is Elizabeth Besudi, and I am the director of the Domains and Jurisdiction Contact Group, the program at the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. The theme of the Domains and Jurisdiction Program Toolkit is DNS level action to address abuses. And if you'll allow me, taking into account that perhaps not everyone here is as familiar with the DNS as others, I thought it would be helpful to sort of walk you through basically how the DNS functions. Taking action to address abuses at the DNS level is sometimes referred to as the nuclear option. And to understand why, again, it's helpful to have a basic understanding of what the domain name system is and how it works. And so at its core, the DNS is an addressing tool. It's one that maps an IP address, which is a series of numbers, to a domain name, which is easier to memorize and to associate with the registrant or the registrant's business or organization. And so the registrant will select the domain name of their choosing using a registrar, who then will input the relevant data into a master file for a given top-level domain, sometimes shorthanded as TLD. These are things that you would know as, for example, .com, .net, or .eu. And the master file, that master file of all domains in a given top-level domain, is managed by the registry. Once the domain name is registered, it can then be associated with an IP address, and it's linked to websites or email servers that the domain name points to and allows to be accessible via the domain name system. And so an action is taken at the DNS level to uncouple or disassociate, if you will, the link between the domain name and the IP address. The website or the associated email server can no longer be located using the domain name. Importantly, the website, for example, would remain accessible, but only via its IP address, meaning the user would have to know that. And so action at the DNS level to address abuses really is, therefore, a drastic remedy that can cut off access to websites for all but the most knowledgeable and savvy internet users. And so for this reason, taking action at the DNS level to address abuses demands the identification and adherence to thresholds. And this toolkit contains resources that help answer the question, really the seminal question, of when is it appropriate to act at the DNS level to address abuses, and then goes on to explore how abuses should be identified, evaluated, and acted upon, all against the backdrop of respect for due process, including, of course, recourse for registrants in the event that action is taken. And so we'll move to the next slide. In terms of the purpose of the toolkit, you see in the caption the word interoperability, tools for interoperability. That word is both purposeful and descriptive. The aim of the toolkit and the aim of our work at the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network is not to push toward uniformity or one-size-fits-all solutions, but rather to produce outcomes, common taxonomies, solutions that are flexible enough to work across different business models among different actors, but which also produce a common understanding of the requisite processes, the procedures, the taxonomies that are used in this case, in the domains program, to address abuses within the DNS, the domain name system. And so if we move to the next slide, I'll just want to start by saying that the toolkit is the product of many, many hours of hard work by leading experts in the industry who have served in the domains contact group since its inception at the end of 2016, beginning of 2017. The contact group is comprised of key actors, experts, subject matter experts, technical operators, governments, civil society, academia, and the like. And each successive contact group has worked tirelessly to tackle the issues that really prove challenging within the DNS. In 2018, the Domains and Jurisdiction Contact Group identified thresholds for action for abuses that are content related and those that are related to technical abuse within the DNS. And these were published in our operational approaches document in the spring of 2019. And then building on the work of the prior year's contact groups, the 2020 contact group focused its efforts on technical abuse and produced a number of resources that are contained in the toolkit. Here you see on the slide 2 columns in the middle and to the right of the slide. The middle column really displays, it's communicating about the pillars of the framework, how we frame and hopefully work toward fleshing out solutions. And you'll see that it's comprised of identification, evaluation, action or choice of action, and recourse. And again, beginning in that middle column with the pillar of identification, what the contact group did was really consider very thoughtfully, what are the various types of technical abuses? What is the requisite due diligence required of notifiers? And I should add DNS operators alike in making notifications and acting upon technical abuse notifications. When and how should registrants be notified when there is an allegation or action taken on technical abuse? And then to the right, you see the very specific outcomes that were produced using this pillar. We have things in the toolkit. We have a typology of notifiers. We have a guide called DNS level action to address technical abuses, which really considers due diligence for notifiers and what's required, what are the best practices and guidelines before making an abuse notification, and also a resource entitled Minimum Components for Technical Abuse Notices, which really is of benefit to both notifiers and to operators who must receive and act upon those notifications, and really helps, I think, clarify a method, a panel, a taxonomy for communication that allows DNS abuses to be handled in a very efficient and effective manner. When we look at the pillar of evaluation, again, we're talking about thresholds, and these thresholds informed and helped guide and produce the DNS operator's decision-making guide to address technical abuse, which is really just chock full of really good information about how operators assess and consider and decide to act or not on technical abuse notifications. If we move to choice of action, again, the group spent a lot of time considering, first and foremost, what are the actions that are available to a DNS operator, again, a registry or a registrar, to address the various types of technical abuse. And then importantly, what are the effects of each type of action when they're applied to a particular abuse case or an abuse report. And this helped inform a very useful guide, the DNS operator's decision-making guide to address technical abuse. Again, informative not only for DNS operators, but for those making abuse notifications. I think it's very valuable to see sort of what goes into the mix. What are the considerations that operators take and should look at when they are evaluating and potentially responding to an abuse notification. And finally, we have recourse, which of course takes into account due process for registrants, as well as transparency. And informed the production of a procedural workflow for technical abuse, which is really very informative. I invite all of you to check it out. That document it's a visual map of sorts that really presents the process for what happens when a technical abuse notification is made, from the making of the notification to the sort of the path that the notice takes through the registrar, through the registry, and it maps the various responsibilities between, by, and among the various actors, all the way through to the conclusion of a particular notice. Very, very helpful, and I really do invite each and every one of you to check it out. All of the outcomes and the resources that are presented here, as my colleagues have said, this toolkit is definitely not solving every problem, but for the problems that have been addressed, I think you'll find that the resources are concrete and they're very useful. If we move to the next slide, we really are hoping, and we do believe, that the toolkit can benefit a wide array array of actors, DNS operators, notifiers, legislators and government, law enforcement. We really do believe that the tools in the toolkit can help, for example, DNS operators in the design of their abuse-related activities, their policies, and equally in their outreach and education to the people they serve who may not always be familiar with how the DNS works and how, for example, notifications should be made and what are the various considerations that must be taken into account when making an attempt to remediate technical abuse. Equally, the toolkit will be of benefit to notifiers, especially those who may not be as familiar with how to detect and report problematic activity within the DNS, and legislators and law enforcement who we hope will benefit. Again, there's very good information on taxonomies, on procedures, on policies, and we think this can really benefit legislatures, law enforcement, governments in designing and implementing effective policies and efficient policies for addressing DNS abuse. With that, I'll conclude my presentation by reminding you to join our breakout room. We can take a deeper dive there. I'll be there ready, willing, and able to answer any questions you may have. So I thank you once again for being here. I hope to see you in the breakout room. And at this point, I'll turn things over to Sophie to continue our program. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Liz. So, as you have heard, these toolkits have been made by the community for the community, and we encourage you to share and distribute them throughout your networks. The Secretariat plans to go on a virtual roadshow throughout the next couple of months, where we will be discussing the toolkits with stakeholders and how they can use them in their day-to-day work. We've already got 12 events planned over the next couple of weeks, including a special launch next week with the Asia Pacific region in partnership with APNIC, Asia Pacific Network Information Center. So thank you very much to APNIC for organising that. So the Secretariat is really at your disposal to assist you and your organisation to use the toolkits in practice. So please get in touch with us. I think my colleagues have posted our contact details in the chat. So please do reach out. And now I'll be giving the floor to my colleague, Yuri Weidman, to share the next steps for the I&J contact groups.
Thank you, Sophie. Hi, I'm Yuri. I joined I&J only last year in September as the first beneficiary of I&J's Young Professional Program. And so since then, I was able to witness very closely the finalization of a lot of the topics and outcomes that were discussed today and that have been made part of the toolkits in the 3 programs. And so it's a great pleasure now to be able to also present that there will be, of course, further topics that the contact groups in the 3 programs will be tackling, because these toolkits, while they represent an important milestone in the work of I&J, are of course not an end to the work of I&J or the I&J contact groups. And so you can see on the slide here just some of the topics that the contact groups will be tackling, and the contact groups will of course in that continue to apply the I&J methodology to really break down the very concrete issues and try to find solutions to concrete issues. And once those solutions are found and are adopted by the contact groups in the form of outcomes such as those in the current toolkits, they may then be incorporated in future iterations of those toolkits as well.
Thanks very much, Yuri. So now is the time where we will be having a short closing, and then we will start the breakout groups. So you should receive in your inbox very soon the connection details for these breakout groups. So you have your choice of the 3 there on the slide. And also we will post the connection details to the breakout groups in the chat. So we really look forward to seeing you, many of you there, so we can, get out of the webinar format perhaps and really discuss and exchange. So now, Bertrand, over to you for the closing remarks. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sophie. Please don't get and rush into the breakout rooms right now. So I have a few comments that I want to share. First of all, thank you for having been with us for the duration of this exercise. It is a lot of information, and I want to add a layer to what has been said already. Do not be intimidated by either the complexity of the issues or the degree of precision of the documents. The toolkits contain, each of them, not only the elements that have been presented here, but a short framing part and an element of methodology. And the framing part and the element of methodology are also something that you can benefit from, because they point towards other resources that can be on the I&J website that allow you to explore in further detail the in and out of the problem that is being addressed. I mention this because some of the issues that we've been discussing here are not only concrete, they are very precise and very technical, but that's the reason why they are addressed, because they are exactly what people are confronted on a day-to-day basis. So please have a look not only at the tools themselves, but also at the framing elements if you want to understand more about what the problem is and what is being addressed. With that, I have the role to close this event that has been a real pleasure. I want to thank again all the different actors who have contributed to this exercise. That includes the people from the contact groups, the coordinators that you've heard about, but it also includes the supporters of the global conference, the institutional supporters of the global conference of I&J, and also the financial supporters, without whom all the activities that we're conducting could not be possible. And I want to highlight how much this pool of supporters is diversified with governments, with foundations, companies, technical operators, in a way that ensures the neutrality of the work that we are doing. And I want also to recognize the partners for the global conferences, which has been France, Canada, and Germany. We will see when the next global conference can take place. I want to thank again also the whole team of I&J. You have seen a certain number of them who have been making the presentations. Express my gratitude to their commitment to the service of the community in general. That goes for the directors, including Frane and Elizabeth, that you've heard, but we had also Ansel Park, who had been contributing to the data toolkit in the past, and who has rejoined the UN now. I want to thank Ajit Francis, who has presented the data toolkit, who is the master of methodology here at I&J and the kingpin of the contact groups support. I want to thank Sophie, who has been the master of ceremony today, but who has engineered the entire communication and the supervision of the preparation of the graphical design and the organization of these toolkits, which is a remarkable result. Edwig Lundström, who's not with us today because she's awaiting a happy moment. She's on maternity leave, but she and Natalia Lungu have been instrumental in organizing the whole logistics of this event, including the invitations. And last but not least, Yuri has been a great help in the last few months as we were finalizing some of these documents. So thank you very much to the team. It's an immense pleasure for me to have them around and to be able to rely upon them. And of course, that includes Paul Fellinger and Martin Hullin, who have not been directly, in the case of Martin, here, but I'm happy to see that in the chat, there was a mention of the work that we're doing in parallel on knowledge mutualization, which is the global status report and the regional status report that we've done in Latin America, and I'm pleased to announce that we plan to do one to have a particular emphasis to Africa in 2020 and 2021, as this was something that was discussed in the chat. In closing, I want to reiterate what I was saying earlier. It is extremely important that these toolkits allow people to implement things on your own that will help the whole ecosystem just work better. There are things that can be done that may look small, but that actually improve the trust, improve the predictability, and improve the relationship between actors who normally do not interact with each other, but bring interoperability into the overall envelope. And in the final element, I have two requests to make of you all. The first one is, please look at those documents, read them, but more importantly, try to take 1 hour in your organization with your colleagues to go through them, just 1 hour, to go through them and see how they can help you, how you can use them. Even if it is a small element, it's worth it. And I'm sure that you will get benefit, and we are, of course, very eager to get your feedback on how you found those things useful, so that we can improve and continue to improve the process after this. The second element is, once you've done that, spend this 1 hour with your colleagues on the toolkit that concerns your sector. Please step back and try to think and ask yourself, who in your immediate network, in your community, in the people you interact with or that you interface with, would benefit from having access to this information? Or would you like to see this information and use it? And so ideally, the second request is, think about those people and try to send those toolkits or the corresponding toolkits to 3 people so that it can percolate, because the more people will be adopting even small actions or large actions, the better it will be for the whole environment. And finally, of course, well, last but not least, the Secretariat, as was mentioned by Sophie, is at your disposition for any additional information you may need, for organizing presentations of the same sort as this one in your community, for developing specific activities regarding understanding what are your specific needs and what are the ways to implement those toolkits and those measures in your particular case and your environment. So with that, thank you all again for your presence. Please go to the breakout rooms where you will have the opportunity to ask whatever questions you may want. And as Sophie said, they will be open for at least 30 minutes and longer if needed, if the desire is present. Thank you again. Have a good end of the day and good discussions in the breakout rooms. And I hope that you will enjoy the toolkits that we have launched today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody, again for having joined. You find in the chat the links to the breakout rooms, and you also find them in your email inbox. So we will see you on the other side. Thank you very much.
Now people are migrating slowly. That's good.
Wonderful. So with this, we're closing the webinar and we see you on the other side. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye. Bye.